Good. I think we'll go ahead and get underway, and then I'll just admit people as they join us. Uh, Last Friday, I didn't quite get through everything I had to, or I wanted to cover that day because we took some time to go over the test, and that took a while. But I introduced the subject by writing on the whiteboard. Nationalism versus internationalism. So those are the two competing approaches or philosophies that countries can take in terms of their relationship with the other countries of the world, how involved they want to be. Do they want to focus more on their own country, their own people, internal affairs, or do they want to be more outward focused and think about their place in the wider world, right? So for nationalism, in parentheses, I put isolationism in quotation marks, just to indicate that that's a term that the average nationalist doesn't use in referencing himself or herself. Isolationism is more of an insult, a put down. And then similarly, with internationalism, that can also be called imperialism. But again, internationalists tend to shy away from that. The people who are more nationalist minded call internationalists imperialists, but that's not a label that they usually like themselves. But there is something about each of those labels, isolation and imperialism, that there is at least a certain amount of truth to each of those labels. Now, with isolationism, that was really the traditional American foreign policy going back to the very beginning in the 1790s under our first president, George Washington. And we really didn't move into more of an international mindset until the 20th century in the early 1900s, especially under Woodrow Wilson. So I just kind of want to walk through a little bit of the history rather than like, these are the traits of nationalism versus internationalism. It's more of a historical approach that I want to share with you tonight for the first portion of the class. Internationalism, well, sorry, let's start over. You could think that isolationism or nationalism, because of the word isolation, you might think, oh, this is the foreign policy of people who want to cut off all contact with other nations. You could even think of it in terms of like an ostrich burying its head in the sand, which I don't know if they actually do that, but that's sort of a stereotype of an ostrich, right? And you might think that, oh, that's an isolationist, person who wants to ignore everything that's going on all around them in the rest of the world. And, it's not only kind of self-defeating because you're not aware of threats and dangers to your own country, but it's also like self-centered. It's selfish. You don't want to help other countries. You don't want to be engaged in anything beyond just taking care of yourself, right? So there are some criticisms that can be attached to it. But for people who are nationalists or isolationists, they tend to not view it that way. They want to be isolated not from all the other countries of the world, but they want to be isolated from the political and military conflicts of other countries. So it's kind of narrowly defined. It's not that people can't travel to other countries. It's not that other foreigners can't come to your own country. It's not that you shouldn't have trade with other countries. It's more specifically the political and military aspects. They don't want alliances, political alliances with other governments, foreign governments, and they're very suspicious of, skeptical of, opposed to military involvement with other countries unless it involves a direct threat to your own country. So where does this nationalist tradition or isolationist tradition come from? Well, it goes all the way back to George Washington, where in his farewell address, as he was leaving office in the late 1790s, he said, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible." So in other words, we're trading, that's commercial relations, but we want to have as little political connection as possible. So this is talking about an alliance with them. He says, "For so far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop." So no more, interactions, formal interactions that lock us in to some sort of a relationship with other countries. Now, in the case of France, they had come to our aid during the American Revolution, so there was a relationship there. If we owed them money, if we owed them a certain, on a quid pro quo, they helped us. Now we have to help them. Okay, he was willing to acknowledge there might be something there, but let's not create any more political relations between us and Europe. And he goes on to flesh this out. He says, "Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. So it's unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics." Vicissitudes means kind of the ups and downs, constant changes, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. So the fact that Europe is always in turmoil, so many countries packed into a relatively small amount of space in comparison. We were 13 states at the time, so we didn't have the whole, a good chunk of the continent yet. But if you compare Europe today to what the United States is, right, it's a lot more countries compared to one country for the expanse from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And then he references specifically here the Atlantic Ocean, saying we are far away from them, thousands of miles away from Europe, and we've got an ocean between us. So we've got like a natural defense, and there's just no reason for us to get involved in all their controversies. And then the most famous line dealing with this in his farewell address, Washington says, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." And it's not just Europe. It would be Asia, it'd be, Africa, South America, whatever country you're talking, or whatever continent or area you're talking about in the world. Our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Then Thomas Jefferson comes along, and he is 2 presidents after Washington, elected in 1800, and he is actually campaigning for the office in 1799, the year before the election, and he says, "I am for free commerce with all nations, political connection with none, and little or no diplomatic establishment," which is kind of interesting and ironic because he had been Washington's Secretary of State. He was our first Secretary of State, which is, the cabinet department focusing on foreign policy. But he doesn't want, a huge diplomatic corps. He doesn't want a huge State Department because he's not real big on political connections. In fact, he says he doesn't want any formal political connections that bind us to other countries. And specifically, again, he references Europe. He says, "I'm not for linking ourselves by new treaties with the quarrels of Europe, entering that field of slaughter to preserve their balance." Doesn't have an interest in that. Once he gets selected president, in his inaugural speech in 1801, he says that we should have peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. So Washington talked about permanent alliances being bad. Jefferson calls them entangling alliances, but it's the same thing. Once you get linked up, you can't get out of them very easily, and he's against it. But again, like Washington, he recognizes that commerce or trade, that's fine. You just don't want to, have some kind of, governmental, military, political connection that binds us as a country. Now, This was the original foreign policy of the United States. It continued on in the 1820s with the creation of the uh, Monroe Doctrine, which was actually written by John Quincy Adams, who was President Monroe's Secretary of State. Adams, there were two parts to the Monroe Doctrine. We usually think about the part that we say Europe should stay out of our backyard. They shouldn't meddle, in the countries to the south of us because that would be a threat to us. But we also promised in the Monroe Doctrine that we would stay out of Europe. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Kind of a two-way street of neutrality or non-intervention. And then John Quincy Adams is famous in the 1820s for also giving a speech that I think it was on the 4th of July, Independence Day, where he was talking about how the United States does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, is the way he put it. He says, we're the well-wishers of freedom for all nations, but we're the guarantor of freedom only for ourselves, not for other countries. I mean, we wish the best for you. Yes, we want you to be free. We want you to prosper, but we're going to worry about ourselves. It's not our job to go out and make sure that you're free and prosperous. And it's also not our job, as he put it, to go in search of monsters to destroy, go abroad, in other words, to foreign countries. So we're not going to fight other people's battles. We're not going to, be the world policeman, which wasn't a term back then, but today we talk about that. It's interesting when I hear politicians talking about, well, we don't want to be the world's policeman. 9 times out of 10, when they say that, there's a but afterwards, and then they go on to use language that means we have to be the world's policeman. They just use different terms. But we need to be the leader of the free world, or we need to, make sure that we maintain the post-war order of freedom and democracy or whatever. So in the end, they usually pivot from saying we don't want to be the policeman of the world, which they know is unpopular with most Americans, but then they go on to say we have to, but they just use a different terminology for it. This kind of policy of staying out, especially of European affairs, continued on, as I said, until World War One. Well, let me take it back. Specifically World War One, I'm thinking in terms of European involvement. But before that, the turning point was 1898, and that's really when I should point out that this was a key turning point. 1917, when we entered World War One, that was another turning point, but 1898 was the first one, where we moved from more of an isolationist or nationalist approach to more of an internationalist or imperialist approach. This was the great period, the 1880s, 1890s, was the great period of European imperialism. For example, it was during that period that Africa was carved up. Almost every square inch of Africa, with the exception of Liberia, and then in East Africa, Ethiopia, or as it was called, Abyssinia at the time, with the exception of those two countries, by the time you get to 1900, every part of Africa has become colonized by European empires. And that's England, that's France, it's Germany, that's Italy, it's Belgium. Those were the 5 main ones. There may have been another 1 or 2 in addition to that. So imperialism was really on the march in Europe. But this was also the period in which the United States, as the historian Frederick, no, what was it? Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner, I think it is. He had a thesis saying that at a certain point, once the frontier closed, once the West was settled, and this was the period right after the Civil War, where we had the so-called Indian Wars in the West, where we kept pushing through the Midwest and then into the Mountain West. The U.S. government fought battles with the native tribes, nations, and in the end, put them on reservations. Once that was settled, then from sea to shining sea, the United States, we kind of like ran out of new territory. And as a result of that, and then as a result of seeing the European example, we started looking around and think, well, maybe it's our turn as a great country. Maybe we need to be a great power in the world as well. And in 1898, that's what you see. You see the annexation of Hawaii. So that set of islands, which the independence had been taken away by American businessmen. Um, uh, let's see, this was 1898, so it would have been in 1893 that had happened. So about 5 years before, the Queen had been overthrown. Basically, she abdicated at gunpoint with Marines standing with rifles outside of her office as she signed away her authority to the Americans. And in 1898, President McKinley said, "Okay, we're going to accept you." We didn't call him a colony, but we're going to accept you uh, as a I don't know what was the term. The word's escaping me, but we annexed them, which means that we added them to the United States, and they weren't a state right away. Essentially a territory for a while, and well, until the late 1950s is when they finally became a U.S. state. So roughly about 50 years, they were a territory of the U.S. We had been using their port. Pearl Harbor had been an important naval port for us, as well as for other countries. But at this point, we were establishing a big modern navy. We needed coaling stations. These ships were still run by steam, and we needed places for them to have reliable places that they could stop to be have the coal added, and this was all part of it. So we get Hawaii in 1898, and the same year we fight a war with Spain, the Spanish-American War. Our government claims we're doing it to free Cuba from Spanish dominion, Spanish captivity. But of course, then once we defeat Spain, it was a short war. Spain was a weak country by then. Once we defeat Spain, we do not set Cuba free. We keep Cuba, we keep the Philippines, we keep Puerto Rico, we keep Guam, all of those different islands we keep as American territories. Now, eventually, Cuba gets its independence. It takes decades for that to happen. Same thing with the Philippines. Eventually, they're set free. Puerto Rico and Guam remain under U.S. Control. Another island that we also add during this same year was part of the Samoan Islands, also in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles away. And we actually buy part of those islands, we call it American Samoa, from Germany. So between those three different transactions, we have essentially colonies, although we don't like calling them colonies, that's what they were, for the first time. And as a result of that, we are not as isolated as we used to be. This is also the exact same period, like around 1900, 1901. The Boxer Rebellion takes place in China. The US and Europe, England, and other countries have this what was known as the open door policy, where we want to open up China to foreign trade. A railroad in Manchuria was being built. We wanted to trade with China. There were some of the Chinese who didn't want to be part of that. That's what the Boxer Rebellion was about. They didn't like foreigners coming in and trying to tell them what to do and living in their country and so on. But all of this adds up to a much more vigorous US federal government saying we also should be a great power in the world, just like England and Germany and France and Russia. Why shouldn't we just as much as they? So then in 1914, when we get involved in the European War, it wasn't really a world war, it was a European war. That is like a second step in that direction. We also see, as a result of that war, the creation of the League of Nations, which was primarily a British and French effort to unite as many countries of the world as possible under one political umbrella. Now, it didn't diminish their sovereignty in the sense that it wasn't a world government, but it was a direction in that it was an effort in that direction, moving toward greater world order. And essentially, it was built on the idea of collective security. So an attack on one member of the League of Nations was going to be considered an attack on all members. And all members were obligated then by treaty to come to the defense of that country that was attacked. And so the argument was this will create peace in the world because no one will dare attack a country that belongs to the League of Nations, because then they know all the wrath of the whole world, or most of the world that belongs to the League, is going to come down on their heads if they do that. And I'm not going to go into detail, in the end, Woodrow Wilson, who was a strong supporter of the League, he couldn't get the Senate to go along with it. He wasn't willing to take any reservations or amendments to the treaty, or they called it a covenant. But essentially, it was a treaty where the U.S. would be admitted into the League after World War I. And there were two separate votes in the Senate, one in 1919, one in 1920. Both of those votes fell short. A majority of the Senate said yes. The leadership of both parties supported entering the League of Nations, but there was a big enough minority, and it was both Republicans and Democrats, who were opposed to any involvement because they felt like this was going against our traditional foreign policy of Jefferson and Washington. This was going to be a permanent alliance. This was going to be an entangling alliance. So there was enough opposition among those nationalists or isolationists that they insisted upon an amendment saying that the U.S. Senate would still have to decide whether or not to declare war, even if our treaty obligation was that, yes, we have to go to war to defend a fellow League member. This stipulated that we were still a sovereign nation, and it would not supersede our Constitution. And Wilson was not willing to accept that or any other amendment. And as a result of that, it ended up dying, even though it had majority support. It didn't have 2/3 support, which is what it needed to get through the Senate. So after 1920, there's a period of about 20 years where we go back into a more traditional foreign policy where we're not paying so much attention to what's going on in Europe. Now, the foot was already in the door. So especially with World War I, we now had this special relationship with England, which today we take for granted, but that wasn't the case before 1917. Keep in mind, a lot of people in America didn't have any great love for England. The Irish Americans tended to hate England. They were Catholics. They felt like England was the oppressive empire that was holding Ireland down. German Americans, and there were millions of them, especially in the Midwest, they tended to be nationalists. They tended to be isolationists. They had no love for England. And so as a result of World War I, we do start establishing a tie with England in a way that then in the late 1930s, when England's attacked by Germany and World War II breaks out in Europe, it was sort of natural, at least for some people, who were more pro-British, especially along the eastern seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard, for us to come to the aid of England. And there was a whole big debate. There was this kind of America First anti-intervention group, And most Americans didn't want us to get involved in World War II. There was a big backlash. They looked at World War I and they thought it was a disaster. By the 1930s, most Americans looked back and thought that whole thing was a mistake. All these people got killed. So many were, injured. Um, and it was all for nothing. We shouldn't have been involved in that. And so even though Hitler was not the Kaiser, and he was, of course, much worse than the Kaiser, there was still this big reluctance because they felt like we've already been burned once on this with this propaganda saying, oh, we have to, stop the Germans, we have to help the British. Most Americans just didn't buy the argument in 1938, 1939, 1940. But after Pearl Harbor, FDR, of course, then brought us into the war and people rallied around. And the US government has never gone back to a nationalist foreign policy consistently since 1941, December 1941, when Pearl Harbor happened. And I guess the point I want to make here is that both Republicans and Democrats have been, the leadership of both parties has been internationalist since 1941. And that's true, through Korea, through Vietnam, through the wars in the Middle East. There's ups and downs. Some wars are successful, some wars are failures. But it's never really changed the fundamental course of the U.S. government since that time. Because almost as soon as the World War I ended, almost as soon as World War II ended in 1945, within 2 years, the Cold War began, and the Cold War lasted for 40 years. And as soon as the Cold War ended, like in 1989, 1990, within 2 years of that, we were at war with Iraq, and the wars in the Middle East began. And I guess you could say they're still going on. I mean, we took a little break for after our troops were withdrawn from Afghanistan, but now we're involved in the Israel war in Gaza, right? So we've had really endless wars since 1990 in the Middle East, and the U.S. has played a major role in all of that. And just like for 40 years we did with the Cold War, and then before that with World War II. So it's never really stopped. So the de facto default foreign policy of our country today is internationalism. In the late 1940s, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, he was a Republican from Michigan. Dutch, by the way, would have probably been from West Michigan, right? That Grand Rapids area. Vandenberg, he's not well known today. This is the only thing he's famous for today, but he was big in his day. He ran for president 2 or 3 times. Very prominent Michigan Republican, and he spoke for internationalists of both parties when he said, politics stops at the water's edge. That's, and I was going to say, who knows if he wrote it? Most politicians, they rely on somebody else to give them their words, but he was a newspaper editor, so he may have actually thought of this himself before he went into politics. And so he said, politics stops at the water's edge. And the point is, we can debate all kinds of things having to do with domestic policy, but Republicans and Democrats, we're united in supporting our government, no matter what it does in terms of foreign policy. And he was assuming, an internationalist approach. And the reason Vandenberg, the reason he carried weight was that he had been an isolationist before Pearl Harbor. So in 1940, when he was running for president, he was seen as one of the leaders of isolationism. Now, having read a lot about Vandenberg, I don't think it'd be too unkind to say this because I think it's true. Vandenberg was an opportunist. He wanted to be president, and he didn't have any deeply held convictions that I can tell. And so this was part of it. He knew which way the wind was blowing. He's kind of a stereotypical ambitious politician. And so once we get into World War II, he decided, oh, okay, isolationism, that's been discredited. Now I'm gonna jump ship and move over to the isolation, or move over to the internationalist position instead. But that, if you keep your ears open, you'll hear that phrase, even now when we debate things, of how involved we should be. And you see it, the the debate over should we give billions, tens of billions of extra dollars to Israel, that's being debated in the Senate and the House this past week, and also Ukraine. That foreign aid package for Ukraine and Israel, leadership of both parties is supporting it. Biden's for it, McConnell's for it, Speaker Johnson's for it. Leadership of both parties for it. But you also have some opposition from, sort of a dissident groups of Republicans and dissident groups of Democrats. Now, they sometimes oppose it for somewhat different reasons, but there's also some overlap between that as well. And you'll hear accusations. I mean, it's kind of jarring in a way to hear it, like a Republican, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, talking about, like, this is imperialism and stuff, because we usually associate that more with like leftists, Democrats and stuff. But there are Republicans who use the same kind of language, feeling like this is none of our business, we should stay out of it. But that's a minority voice within both parties. Trump, even though he was president and in theory he was leader of his party, he is also a minority voice. He is somebody who campaigned against the U.S. being the policeman of the world, which is kind of and he even used, would talk about things like we don't need to have imperialism. He's referred to the military-industrial complex, saying, this is what's driving this foreign policy where we want to, give all this aid to other countries so they can buy our weapons. He seems very skeptical of U.S. involvement politically and militarily with the rest of the world. And his very slogan, America First. I mean, that was used by the anti-World War II people in the late 30s, early 40s, before Pearl Harbor. The America First Committee was called that. And then if you go back 20 years before, it was used by the people who were against the League of Nations. They also used that slogan, America First. So he's much more of a nationalist, which puts him at odds with most of the leaders of his party. There are some who are more nationalist, Rand Paul from Kentucky, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, Mike Lee of Utah. There's some, but it's a minority point of view within his own party. And then Trump, being Trump, has never been very consistent either. So even as president, he picked a bunch of people that he would call neocons, neoconservatives, who tend to want a very aggressive, active involvement by the U.S. and the rest of the world. He appointed a bunch of them to his cabinet. John Bolton, as his national security advisor, is like a perfect example of somebody who didn't agree with Trump at all, and yet Trump picked him for that high position, and then later on he fires him, right? So and then Bolton writes a whole book denouncing him and shows up on CNN on a regular basis to say how terrible Trump is and stuff. So it's like, even though Trump has more of a nationalist perspective, I think either he gets advice from people that don't agree with him, or he's just naive, and because he's not a professional politician and doesn't know how Washington works. But he clearly was not very consistent in the people that he picked to advise him and to run his government. And now we'll see if he gets elected again. We'll have to see if it's any different. But it has caused constant conflict, and it's not an accident that a lot of the accusations against Trump have to do with foreign policy. He was impeached because he was threatening the president of Ukraine the first time. He was accused of being a puppet of Putin, and that he was colluding with the Russian government. It's not an accident that foreign policy is driven a lot of the hostility toward Trump, because people just feel like he's irresponsible and he's dangerous, and he's not protecting this legacy of U.S. leadership of the world, because he wants to turn inward and not be so involved. That's all I have to say on the subject of internationalism. Are there any questions or comments about anything that I just got through talking about, internationalism versus nationalism? Anything you want to say about any of that?
Would you say that America has natural allies, like with AUKUS, Australia and the United Kingdom? Are they natural allies to us?
Um, well, I don't know that I would I don't know that I would describe them as natural allies because in a way they seem natural today just because we've been so allied with the Brits, the United Kingdom, and the larger, what used to be part of the British Empire, like Australia, Canada, especially. We've been allied with them for so long. But that's really only been a little over 100 years with World War One. Prior to that, like I say, Britain was often used as an example of like, well, that's the decadent old world. They don't have a republic like us. They still have a monarchy. Um, a lot of Americans were either uninterested in helping the British Empire to protect itself, or were hostile to it. Like I said, you had the Irish, you had people who have, German ancestry, Italian ancestry. They didn't care what happened to the British. So certainly there is a natural thing where a lot of us in America are of English descent, but then, like even me. Taylor is an English name, but I'm about half German if you add up all my ancestors. So even me, the English part is a minority. So I don't feel like any. I mean, to some extent, because they speak the English language, there's a lot of commonalities, and since in terms of music and entertainment and stuff like that, a lot of it has come from England in the last 50, 60 years. Um, but I don't know that I would necessarily say it's natural because you go back 150 years, people would have said, we should have followed Jefferson and Washington's advice and not had an undue attachment to England. Um, and if anything, we were still kind of holding a grudge against them for the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So back then, though that was fresher in people's minds, and so some people still held a grudge about that too. Is that Yeah, I don't know that I'm necessarily right about that, John, but that's my opinion, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. To think about it in a more critical sense, I don't think the US has had a natural ally throughout its whole existence against one like arch nemesis that we've had throughout our whole existence. It's definitely
Right.
changed.
I think so. It's shifted over time, but because that alliance has been in place for so long, now we see it as sort of like natural, you know, and we sort of take it for granted. But that wouldn't have been true before the 1910s. Yeah. Anybody else, comment or question? Okay, well, if not, I'm going to turn now to this is the topic on the syllabus for tonight, and I don't have a whole lot that I want to say about this, other than I guess I can put a plug in for my class, Global Security Issues, which actually takes a deep dive into the topic of terrorism. Global Security Issues is, well, let's see, when is it being? It's being offered in the fall. What time is it though? Um, I suppose I'm not going to have that information. I think it's a Tuesday, Thursday class, and I think it's something like, I think it's afternoon. But you can look it up. If you're interested, global security issues focuses really on war and on terrorism, those two topics. And one of the kind of interesting things I think we do there, um, well, there's several interesting things. One is we read a book by Jim Skillen, who was the founder of the Center for Public Justice, or CPJ, which is in Washington, D.C. But at one time, Skillen was a professor here at Dort, and he founded what became CPJ here at Dort, which is a Christian like think tank, essentially. Um, and then another thing we do is uh, we have this whole big book, Terrorism and Homeland Security, which is one of the textbooks that we use for the book, for the class, I should say. And then also we have presentations where the students in terms of war present your own, you kind of come up with your own philosophy, and then you do a presentation to the class on that in terms of both personal security, but also national security. I mean, what sort of reaction should you have? I mean, to what extent do you think violence is justified, and if so, under what circumstances? So I'm not going to talk a lot about terrorism in this class, the one that we're doing right now, public policy, but I do want to mention that terrorism, of course, I was going to say it's on our minds, but it's been on our minds as Americans for many years, certainly since 9/11 back in 2001, but with what's going on with Hamas and Israel and the Middle East, it just keeps coming back more and more. One thing to say about terrorism is that it's described as a tool of the weak. Terrorism is a tool of the weak. And I say that because terrorism traditionally is defined as targeting civilian population. So rather than making a frontal assault on the government itself, it targets civilians. Now, that's not always true, because you can have terrorist attacks on military targets. So terrorists can attack other people too, but usually it's civilians, and usually it involves an element of surprise. So rather than moving out in the open and making a frontal assault against a government, it will be a secret, clandestine surprise attack on the people of a country that are represented by the government. And then the hope is that the people will be terrorized by the attack and then put pressure on the government to do what the terrorists want. Okay, so I'm going to follow that logic in a moment, but the reason it's called a tool of the weak is that if you are a government, or if you're a group of people who are militarily strong enough to meet your enemy on the open battlefield, so to speak, although wars don't, we don't usually meet on fields of battle anymore like we did in the old days. But if you were going to meet the government openly and attack them, if you were strong enough to do that, you would. But terrorists usually resort to terrorism because they're not in a position to do that. So a tool of the weak. Now, this idea that, oh, if we terrorize the people, then they will turn to the government and say, we're afraid, stop doing these policies that the terrorists don't want. Do you think that happens? Is that a strategy that you think works well? That when most people are terrorized by terrorists, do they get angry at the government and say, stop doing this, stop making the terrorists mad, so they leave us alone? I'll tell you, the answer is no. That rarely works. Usually when people are terrorized by terrorists, they hate the terrorists. And their first instinct is not to look at the policies of their government and say, oh, why did the terrorists attack us? Oh, it's because we're friends with Israel. It's because we have military bases in Saudi Arabia. Oh, maybe our government should stop doing that, and then the terrorists will leave us alone. That's not what they do. They usually say, kill the terrorists, wipe them out, do whatever it takes to keep us safe, right? So it's even if I were talking to terrorists, what I would tell them is, even aside from the ethics of terrorism, of killing innocent people, which is wrong, it's evil, but even aside from that, it's also self-defeating to engage in terrorism, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to get targeted. You're not going to get the changes in policy that you're wanting as a result of the terrorist attacks. Every now and then it works. I think of the example, well, I'd have to look it up to find out exactly when it was. An attack, it was like on a subway. 2004 Madrid train bombings. It was a series of coordinated bombings on a commuter train system of of Madrid. The explosions killed almost 200 people. It injured over 2,000 people. Why did they do it? It was people who were either members of Al-Qaeda or allied with Al-Qaeda. And they were angry because the Spanish government was allied with the United States in fighting the war against terrorism. So they were upset about the US involvement and then by extension, Spain's involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. At first, the assumption was, oh, these must be Basque terrorists, which is a group of an ethnic group in Spain that wants to break away and have their own country. But it wasn't Basque terrorists. It was violent Islamic terrorists who did it. And what happened? Spain actually decided we're pulling our troops out of Iraq. We're pulling our troops out of Afghanistan. So that was one of the rare examples where terrorist attacks actually worked in achieving what they were trying to achieve. Now, that's maybe the 10% of the time. It's an example of the 1 out of 10 times that you'd see that result. Usually you see just the opposite. The government would double down on what they do, and people are afraid to say, is there something about the policies of our government that's inviting these attacks, or that are making us vulnerable to these attacks? In the case of Spain, the government was willing to back out because we were kind of doing this. They were doing it as a favor to the U.S. They were kind of tagging along in a NATO sense, but they didn't have, they weren't really invested in these wars like the U.S. is, or even like England, was. But the U.S., they will, if they're questioned, like after the 9/11 attacks, there were people on the nationalist wing of the Republican Party, like Ron Paul, who was in Congress at the time. He's Rand Paul's father, and he ran for president 3 times. Ron Paul, in debates, he would bring this up and he'd say, what we're really seeing here is what the CIA calls blowback. They're attacking us because of the things that we have done in the Middle East. That's why they hate us. It's not they hate us because we're free or because we're a democracy. They hate us because they hate our policies. We're meddling in other people's affairs in the Middle East, backing Israel against the Palestinians, having bases in Saudi Arabia, attacking Iraq, all these different things. That's why Al-Qaeda attacked us. They didn't attack Canada. They didn't attack Luxembourg or the Netherlands. They attacked the U.S. because the U.S. is meddling in the Middle East. And so his argument was the CIA calls that blowback. It's like an unintended consequence of foreign policy or military or intelligence policies. And he said, so what we should do is get out of the Middle East. But as he was saying that, especially in the years right after 9/11, people hear that and they say, well, that sounds like propaganda from Al-Qaeda. That sounds like you're a traitor, like you're blaming the victim. You're blaming the US for these attacks. So it's a tricky thing to do that, because even though I think there's some validity to his argument, he's basically saying, like, if you stick your hand in a hornet's nest, don't be surprised if you get stung. If you don't want to get stung, stop sticking your hand in a hornet's nest. That's really what he was saying. But right after you've been stung, it sounds like you're blaming the person who was doing it, and you're siding with the hornets, right? So, or siding with the terrorists in this case. So it's a tricky situation. When it comes to terrorism, there's different responses. I'm going to finish with this. There's kind of 4 categories of responses to terrorist attacks that a government can take. The first would be legal response. You could try to track down and arrest the terrorists and bring them to justice, put them on trial. If they're convicted, you could punish them. And we did a little bit of that after 9/11. Our government did, but not much. 1 or 2 people were tried in federal courts, but early on, we decided, well, suspects we're going to put in Guantanamo Bay. the U.S. Military facility down there. We're not going to bring them into a courtroom in Manhattan, especially because Manhattan is where the Twin Towers attacks occurred. We're not going to bring them there and then like put them on trial and then have them like it would be so traumatic for the people of New York, and then they would use the trial as a way to, use propaganda as they're testifying. And so we really did not take the legal approach very much after 9/11. We took the second approach, which was military. So rather than treating the terrorists as criminals, we treated them as like enemies. And like this was a military attack. And even though they didn't represent a country specifically, because they were based in Afghanistan, we blamed the Taliban for allowing them to operate in Afghanistan. So we decided to make war against the Taliban in Afghanistan. So the military approach was the primary way we responded. The second way we responded was security. We beefed up security to make sure that attack like that couldn't happen again. And so we created the Department of Homeland Security, including TSA, in the airports to just increase the security to the point where hopefully that could never happen again. Of course, all the great emphasis on airline security, some of it may have been justified, but from my point of view, we usually end up fighting the last war. It's like, okay, the next terrorist attack probably isn't going to be an airplane. It's going to be something else, right? And so but nevertheless, whether this was a good idea or not, it's become institutionalized and it's become a lot less pleasant to fly as a result of that, or at least to get through airports than it used to be prior to 9/11. The fourth approach, after legal, military, and security, the fourth approach is policy. And this is where you could look at the root causes of terrorism. What is it that, encouraged the terrorism or sparked the terrorist hatred toward your country or toward your government? And then do you need to change something in terms of the policy of the government to address that? But as I said, that one pretty much was off the table because it sounds like you're siding with the terrorists if you start changing your policies under the threat of more terrorist attacks. It's a tough sell for two reasons. Because average people feel like, well, now you're blaming us and our government and our country for what happened. So that goes against our patriotic outrage over what's happened. But then the second thing is the government doesn't want to change its own policies. So especially policies as deep as our involvement in the Middle East. I mean, that's been going on well, very heavily after World War II. We basically replaced the French and the British colonies that they inherited it from the Ottoman Empire after World War I. Basically, the U.S. Took that role over in the Middle East in the 1940s. And so for us to say after 60 years, we're going to change our involvement in the Middle East wasn't likely to happen. So there really wasn't much of a policy change. It was more of a doubling down, if anything. That's what I wanted to say about terrorism tonight, 7:59, but we have another minute or two or three. Anybody have questions or comments on the subject of terrorism? No? All right. Let's see here. Jigby, you're the only person I can see, but I'm not shaming all the rest of you to say turn your video on. But this is probably why the class didn't want to meet in person. You've gotten to like the idea that you can be part of the Zoom where you could be doing other things, right, too, or you could be eating while we're doing this, which is fine. I do the same thing when I'm on Zooms, not when I'm teaching, but when I'm not teaching, it's kind of nice to have that flexibility. The rest of you, hopefully you're watching this later on video on YouTube. So same with you. You've got some flexibility to watch this at your own convenience, which works out fine as well. We've only got one more Zoom session next Wednesday night. That's May 1st. We'll talk about world government a week from tonight. When we get together this Friday, we'll talk about war. We'll talk about patriotism. A week from Friday will be our last class period. We'll talk about party choice for Christians. So we'll talk about, well, how do we decide, or how should we decide whether we want to be a Republican or a Democrat or something else? That is also the last class period, and so it is the day that the term paper is due. And remember, the term paper, that's the one asking the question, if you could identify like one policy of a political party that you think is especially bad, what would that be? And you can write about that. So, and then just to recap, was asked very early on tonight, when is the final? The final is on Tuesday, May 7th at 8 o'clock in the morning. So we'll have an early morning sort of final. That's going to do it for tonight. So thank you for those who were here in real time, and thanks for the rest of you that are joining us by video later. And I will talk to you later. Hopefully see you on Friday. So have a good rest of your night, and have a good Thursday as well. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.